Health systems will differ in size. They'll differ in their organizational and reporting structure. Certainly, they'll differ in their priorities. We see this both from system to system and then within a system over time. I think the coronavirus pandemic has really underscored the changing priorities that we've seen. And then linking to this second point in this table, the degree of centralization really does vary from site to site. And so the fact that these are so heterogeneous means that implementation is very difficult and it becomes a hyper-local task. It's not just the design or the structure of health systems that are different. Their priorities may be different, and their priorities will actually differ within an organization as well. So these are not all of the domains of leadership or of thought within any kind of a health system, but I put up these three domains as particularly relevant. So there's health information technology on the left in red. There's the clinical and operational leaders in blue in the middle. Again, a heterogeneous group, but I think we can lump them all together as a group that is focused on measuring clinical excellence and delivering it. And then on the right in green are the research leaders. I put some of the priorities for each of these groups in boxes underneath those headers. So health IT is invested in maintaining the products that they've built and that are necessary for the continuity of clinical care and the continuity of communication. They have to maintain uptime for the health record. They have to maintain uptime for the laboratory systems and the pathology systems. They have to maintain the phone systems in your hospital. They also have to maintain the security of all of those systems as well. And there have been some high-profile incidences in the news within the last couple of years when that has been breached. And so these things take front burner for health IT, and this is where they spend most of their time and thought and resources. Clinical leaders are obviously concerned about clinical problems, both because that matters for patient care, but also because that matters for stability of revenue. And finally, research leaders are sometimes thinking on a different timescale. They're interested in discovery type activities, dissemination of research findings, and securing and maintaining research funding. Oftentimes, those silos can be advantageous because they allow each group to focus on what it does best and run with it. And that can be really, really useful. There are disadvantages, though, and the disadvantages become more prominent the more intersection there is between each of those silos to tackle a given problem. And I think when it comes to implementing artificial intelligence in the health record and using it in clinical work, we're seeing that juxtaposition really tightly. We need to have deep health IT expertise and work in order to put something into place and keep it working. We need to really understand the clinical and operational environment so that we know what problems we're solving and how we can actually work with clinical teams to make their care better. And we need to understand research priorities in terms of sort of self-betterment. Are we learning from what we're doing, and are we designing the better way forward? I note here at the bottom in this last bullet point, this juxtaposition, but really sort of a comparison of operations versus research. This is a dichotomy that I think is both artificial and true. It's artificial in the sense that much of what we're doing and what we're talking about today has operational work and research work. And these things have to happen in lockstep in order to go well. At the same time, they also are really separate entities. Research requires a different stream of sort of approvals and oversights than clinical operations does. They exist on different timescales. And so as we think about all of those the items as part of the backdrop here, the other point that I really want to underscore is that AI in and of itself is a means, not an end. And what I mean by that is that implementing an AI tool or developing a new AI service isn't a goal in and of itself. It's in service of something else that we need, generally something that is patient-centered or system-centered. Does it make clinical care better? Does it make workflows easier? Does it lead to better retention of nurses or better satisfaction with the job? Is it in response to some kind of an external incentive or pressure, which can help alleviate financial hardships or make something else go more smoothly? And so keeping this in mind can be really helpful because one of the first questions to ask is, okay, you've asked me to turn this tool on, or to install this tool, or to build this tool. To do what? And I think keeping that at the front of mind can really be helpful in planning these. It's not trivial from a cost standpoint. That cost may be in real money, but it also may be in time and expertise and competing priorities. The cost I put into these different domains because some of them I think are a bit hidden or unexpected. So it certainly is sort of a relatively transparent cost to purchase a vendor solution, either from the EHR vendor or from a company that is selling an AI tool that can be run in the EHR or alongside the EHR. But there is additional work that costs money to support that. Are the data that that model would need accessible, and do they have a high uptime so that they can be accessible in the real world? Are they clean and are they well maintained so that they can be used now and in the future? If not, what's it going to take to keep it that way? Does the model need a separate environment to be up and running 24/7, 365 in order to actually run calculations? Or can this run natively within the electronic health record? Who's going to be responsible for monitoring? This is going to be an iterative, long-standing check-in on the model's performance. And understanding who's responsible for that and who's responsible for making changes based on the monitoring findings can also help to allocate resources for that. These models, in and of themselves, generally can't make care or outcomes better. Most AI tools are designed to change clinician behavior in some way or change the system's behavior in some way. And in order for that to happen, the clinicians and people who are actually doing care have to be aware of it. They have to be able to use it in order to make their changes. And so the training and promotion of use and sort of evangelizing of such a system is another cost. And then one that I think is really unmeasurable is the idea of unintended consequences. If we change one thing, what happens downstream? And could that actually make additional problems that now need to be addressed? Sometimes it can, and sometimes it can't. And like I said, it's hard to predict. But I think building in some sense of those costs into a budget and into a plan and a value proposition are really important. So how do you build all of those things? Well, it's not something that can be done at the individual level. It really has to be done by governance. And that governance, I think, is always going to be tiered. And this is a really interesting opportunity to talk about it with a group who is not based in the United States. And so I'll have less familiarity with what national regulations may look like. Certainly in the US, we do see that the federal landscape with regard to regulating AI in health is evolving relatively rapidly, and I think that the US government is putting some attention on items like software as a medical device. It's not just national leadership, though. This is also happening at a regional level. And so the state of California is a good example of this, where there actually is legislature under review right now regarding transparency for sort of care communication that has been done by a chatbot, for instance, by GPT. And so letting patients know that AI or that machine learning models are involved in their care, involved in the communication about their care, may be something that is mandated and is governed. This may happen at a health system. And so in the US, there have been sort of, large multi-state, multi-city health systems that have bought up hospitals across a region. And then those systems try to practice economies of scale by getting all of the hospitals and clinics onto the same system. When they invest in a tool, that is implicit governance because they're essentially making the decisions about what everybody else is going to be using. The most important type of governance, though, I think, and the one that we're going to talk about mostly today, is the local governance. I put on here last mile evaluation as just one example of that. What I mean by that is essentially the decisions that would go into place for day-to-day users and day-to-day practitioners around this. If this model is running, how often is it going to generate alerts? Who will get those alerts? What will they look like? Who should you call if the alerts are causing problems? This is an essay that came out yesterday in one of the Nature subjournals, Nature Machine Intelligence. And it was co-authored by a team of researchers at University of Michigan and Duke University, both in the US. Karandeep Singh is a name that many of you may know. Karandeep uh, delivered half of this lecture with me at SAIL in San Juan, Puerto Rico earlier this year. And so I've kind of evolved some of my own thinking from the talk that Karandeep and I give. And he gives a really wonderful talk on a lot of, I think, very high-level strategic issues with regard to our national priorities and how governance should go. And my focus is really a bit more on the implementation science of this. And so I'll try to take what I've learned from Karandeep and move into the tactics from there. But he and his co-authors have made, I think, a very effective argument that many of these issues, when it comes to implementation, are going to be local and they are unavoidably so. And that's this box that I've tried to highlight in the middle here. Um, the clinicians delivering care and the team of clinicians and other people who are involved at a specific site are going to be immediately acting and immediately liable and accountable for what happens based on these. So there does need to be a lot of local awareness and attention around it. The second is that the real world evaluation has to occur locally. If you don't know how much lead time a model is giving you for a new event coming up in your actual clinics, you're not going to be able to make very many useful decisions based on that. And so because of this, I think there is now this imperative that most health systems, if not all health systems, really develop teams of expertise and sort of strong communication in this area. That's hard to do. It's a lot of overhead. And so if you are small, if you are already resource and constrained, how do you take from your limited pot of resources and try to build these out? And these authors make a pretty effective case for doing so collaboratively with other small groups or other medium-sized groups that may be in a similar situation to you and may want to share some of these best practices and standards. And so I think this is a really unique idea and something that's going to get a lot of traction as we go forward. I also think it behooves all of us then for trying to be very transparent about what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it, both where are our strengths and where are our opportunities to grow. And so I'm new to OHSU. This is something that I don't have a lot of hands-on experience here yet, although I can speak to my prior experiences observing it at a bigger health system. We have a data governance structure that has been in place for several years. And this has to do not with the AI models themselves, but with the underlying data. Who is responsible for them? How are they structured and stored? What is our cadence for observing and maintaining them? How do we think about the next ways to sort of steward this and grow this in the future? And what we're doing right now is sort of growing our idea of data governance and pairing it with this new emphasis on AI governance for health. And so forming that committee, developing a charter are all very active and dynamic things that are happening at OHSU right now. And it's quite exciting. So in real world terms, what do I mean by AI governance? It's pragmatic decisions like this. Some of these decisions seem low level and tactical at first. And then when you take a step back, you realize that they actually are reflective of big strategic priorities that your organization may be making or may be choosing explicitly, meaning aware of this and leaning in, or choosing it implicitly, essentially because choosing one option, sort of by definition, closes off other doors. So some of the questions. Who is the person or persons who have the ability to approve which models are integrated into the electronic health record? Do those same people who give that sort of executive okay, do they have the direct control over the resources needed to do so? Meaning, can they direct data science, engineering, and EHR support to make that happen? Or do they need to work in tandem with somebody else? Because that would be a form of implicit dual governance. How do you prioritize which models might be turned on first when there are many in waiting in queue? What if there are two different models to solve the same problem that have been developed by competing research groups or by multiple vendors, or one by an internal research group and one by a vendor? How do you make those decisions? When you go to update a model, does the new version require reapproval or not? What happens if a model stops working as intended? Who do you call? What is their expected response? And then decisions about what role does the existing IT infrastructure and IT service play in supporting these things? It's often very challenging for operational IT to support a research-based model because they're unfamiliar with it, and because the new research project hasn't come with additional resources to get more people involved in doing this. There are examples of frameworks that are out there now in the ether. And some of these are from philanthropically funded groups. Some of them are from U.S. national entities, and I want to share just a sort of overview of two of them. So one of them is CHAI, the Coalition for Health AI, and the second is HYPE, the Health AI Partnership. These two groups are doing only partially overlapping work, meaning that they exist really nicely to complement one another. So CHAI's mission is to develop guidelines and guardrails to drive good care by promoting the adoption of fair and credible and transparent health AI systems. So I think they're mostly focused on fairness and transparency and preventing missteps, meaning to avoid propagating biases, propagating harm through the use of AI. And so I think about CHAI as sort of a group that is most attentive to judicious use and safe use and appropriate use. And I think health AI partnership, the HYPE group, is a bit more focused on the what I would call as sort of the implementation strategies or the implementation processes. In other words, how do you do this most effectively? Obviously, those are both extraordinarily important, and I see a lot of sort of potential partnership for those two groups. And OHSU is not involved in either of them right now, but I think certainly are familiar with and connected with people who are leading those. And so we're very excited to see what those groups put forth in terms of guidelines and position papers and toolboxes to help different groups use them. I'm sharing right now a screenshot from the HYPE website in which they actually talk about their rubric for going through essentially a go live for an AI solution. And it talks step by step through each of these chunks. And then, although this is just a screenshot and not interactive, if you click on the arrows next to each one of these bullet points here, it will then unfold and show you some of the pragmatic do's and don'ts and pitfalls to avoid going through each of those steps. One area in which I am decidedly not an expert is the idea of national or federal governance frameworks for these sorts of systems. And so I will just mention that both the NIST, which is the United States National Institute for Standards and Technology, and the executive branch of the United States government have both put out frameworks and blueprints to try to do this right. And I think, again, these probably exist as complements to one another rather than as sort of competing approaches. And they're there and they're publicly available. But I would refer you to people such as Karen Deep, who know a lot more about this than I do, for a deeper dive and a more thorough comment. The last thing I'll say, just on the topic of sort of national regulation in this, is that the United States Food and Drug Administration, again, another federal entity, has issued some guidance stating that AI tools for health probably need to be regulated as medical devices. So these are software as medical device. You can see the dates on these, right? So this document was issued in September of 2022, relatively new, not even a year old. And I think this is going to be a continued evolving conversation. This is from the literature. This is a 2020 paper in NPJ Digital Medicine, just listing off the individual approvals for AI-based medical devices or software solutions. It's small, right? The number that had been approved in 2020 was sort of able to fit on one page. Most of these fit into the radiology bin. Those are the dark green lines here. The remainder were fit into sort of precision oncology and precision cardiology. And so right now we're seeing that this is, I think, an opportunity for growth and disclosure, and more will happen on this front. So let's take a slightly sort of adjusted approach now and think about implementation in the real world. We've talked a little bit about the importance of governance to make sure that we're planning appropriately. And we'll talk more about what it would mean to put a governance team together and make these decisions towards the end of today's conversation. But in order to, I think, understand that better, we really should contextualize that conversation with what it might look like in terms of specific activities. So here's the list that I came up with when I was thinking about the things that we would get engaged in deciding about implementing a model. How does the request come in and who triages it? What's our process for selecting models? What's our process for designing or adapting clinical workflows around a model? What's our process for evaluating a model one time? And then what's our process for doing so continually, for monitoring and updating? So how do model requests get initiated? Um, Conceptually, these can come two directions. They can come top down, meaning from an executive who says, this is now a strategic priority. We need to do this. Some reasons might be to capture more revenue or because there are reimbursement penalties that sort of make a particular disease or syndrome or problem an institutional priority. It may be because the system is an outlier. If you sort of find that you have poor performance in one area, it may be that somebody says, well, let's try to fix this and let's use AI to do so. These also can be bottom up. So these might come from a committee. The hospital sepsis committee could say, we think we need a tool to do this better. Can we build one? Can we buy one? They might come from a department level issue in the same way. And then I think actually most commonly these come from research, either funded or unfunded research, where um, clever and creative people build good models and test them on observed data, and things look good. And they think, okay, it's time to implement this. And so they bring it up to say, can we please try to turn this on and evaluate it? So if your group, if your governance committee or your governance apparatus gets approached for, possibly implementing a new AI tool or solution, this is where I think we ought to start. It's a lot of question asking. The biggest questions that I would suggest asking are, what is the clinical or operational problem to be solved? Um, it really, really, really matters that this can be articulated exceptionally clearly and in a measurable way. If you can't define the problem and you can't measure the problem, it's going to be really hard to know if your new solution is doing any better. It also really helps for the underlying logic model, meaning, can you convince me that an AI tool will help solve this problem or might help solve this problem? It doesn't have to, be world-class, multi-center randomized trial evidence already. It can just be a compelling mechanism of changing clinical care and thereby resulting in better outcomes. So explaining what the problem is and explaining how using the algorithm or the AI tool or the ML tool will help are the first two questions that come to my mind. And then relatedly is asking, what's the plan for the clinical workflow? Many times, researchers who are building these models are not the same people as who would be developing those workflows. That's okay. Everybody has their own expertise. And so this is usually an opportunity to partner model developers with clinicians, with behavioral health experts, with implementation scientists, or quality and safety experts. And so if your governance committee has a good thread to who those people are, it can be really helpful then to say, this is an interesting idea, this is an interesting model. It looks like your team doesn't quite have these people on it just yet. Let's partner you together and see what you can come up with in terms of an expected new workflow. It doesn't have to be the final new workflow. In fact, it probably shouldn't. I would suggest being open to changes and modifications and being open to some uncertainty around that. But at least having the right people in the room can be essential there. The next question then is this going to be operations or is this going to be research? This has to do with both health IT governance and the people that might be available to do the implementation and maintenance. This also is going to inform a lot of your decisions about regulatory approvals. If you want to turn on a clinical care AI tool for real world use and do it for research, you're doing a clinical trial. And so understanding how that will work and what is needed to do that is, I think, going to be particularly important. If you're doing it and not doing it primarily for research, but doing it for standard operating procedures, your sepsis committee tells you, we have a problem with delayed recognition of sepsis. We need a tool to recognize it earlier. We have already talked to vendors and vetted it, and we see this tool as the right one to go with. That's an operations problem. Usually IRBs can help to sort that out. It can be a bit tricky in some gray zones, but I think getting a good answer to that question will help you decide the speed with which you need to move. So to that first point I mentioned, the problem articulation, this is generally kind of the set of questions that I think about. What's the outcome? what's the behavior change that you think is going to happen for clinical care? How will the model drive that behavior change, and how are you going to measure it? And I have, visual logic models for individual projects, but those are usually very hard to put on a single slide because they're so dense, and I just didn't think that would be very helpful. So instead, I tried to lay it out in just very superficial terms. So if the problem is that sepsis outcomes are bad, and you would say the outcomes are bad because of suboptimal sepsis care, well, then we can hypothesize that if we can recognize sepsis more consistently and earlier, care might get better. If that's the case, the intervention being given here is actually better sepsis care, right? That's the clinical intervention. Patients with sepsis are going to get cultured and given fluids and given antimicrobials earlier. The implementation strategy is what the model is a part of. So this is the strategy through which we are going to bring about better sepsis care. And I'll talk more about this in sort of implementation science terms in about maybe 15 more slides or so. But I think recognizing that like the model in isolation won't do anything to patients, even if it is a model that is actually forcing care functions, it still has to drive some intervention forward, like sort of, putting a patient on a particular pathway or exposing them to a new care flow or something like that. So once you've kind of decided that this is a problem to be solved and that a model or an AI solution is the right way to solve it, you need to choose a model or build a model. And this, I've put it into these three bins, although frankly, it probably runs on a bit more of a continuous spectrum. You can develop something in-house, you can coordinate between your operations and research team, you can go purchase something off the shelf from a vendor, but you can do something in between as well. You can work with vendors to tinker with and adapt one of their models, etc. There are some things to keep in mind. So, vendor models are often incompletely described and sort of are usually built for very, very narrow use cases through which the vendor can demonstrate, good performance measures. And so thinking about off-label use where the build case is not really aligned with the intended use case can be really challenging. So I wouldn't necessarily take vendor information at face value, although you should still take it. So the sort of recommendations that I can think about when you're selecting a model, try to be objective and rigorous about the selection criteria. Pre-specify the priorities. Those priorities might be accuracy performance measures. They may be sort of in silico measures like the area under the curve. They may be a number needed to evaluate. They may be numbers of false positives, etc. And pre-specify your selection criteria. And those criteria may be performance, but they also may be cost, right? If you're getting incremental gains and costing a lot more, that may not be the most sort of effective use of resources. And so I think pre-specifying like the ratios that you might use to evaluate those things can be particularly helpful upfront. I also think it's really good practice to understand what's going into the model. Now, vendor models are oftentimes black box, meaning that they won't tell you everything that's under the hood. I think that's okay. I understand that they have a business to protect and they need to sort of keep their intellectual property secure. And so, seeking full model weights and things like that from a vendor model may not be possible. But I do think that understanding contextual data, meaning what was the setting in which this model was trained? Was it all inpatients? Did it include emergency department patients? Did it include ICU patients? Where are the data sets and how old are they? Did clinical care change since then? A sepsis data set from before COVID is going to perform very differently than a sepsis data set from 2020. What variables are in the model? Well, I don't think that vendors necessarily need to disclose all the weights. I do think that it would be good for them to disclose in general what the specific variables are, meaning not just demographics, but which demographic variables, not just clinical vital signs, but which vital signs. Those sorts of things I think can be really helpful to know. And I'll explain why in a minute. The don'ts I've already mentioned, right? So stated performance needs to be taken sort of with a grain of salt and put next to real world performance if at all possible. This sort of comment I've made about black box solutions, I think I worry a lot about information leakage in building models. And so when I get a model that's brought in front of me where the variables that are there and how those variables were obtained, when that information is not available, I sometimes get a bit concerned. How do I know that there isn't accidental infiltration of outcomes, either explicitly or implicitly, because the variables in the model would depend on a particular outcome? You can get that information without needing to get the fine details of whether the variable is modeled as a continuous versus a threshold, whether it's linear versus a spline, right? I mean, that might be a bit more proprietary, but understanding these are vital signs and this is the time frame in which vital signs were eligible to be collected, I think that information can be really helpful and is quite important. Um, there's a sort of interesting series of case studies in which, understanding the variables that go into the model can be really helpful. And one of the more prominent ones that was in the United States media back a couple of years ago was a vendor model that would predict no shows to clinic. And one of the variables, or several of the variables that were in the model were variables that would essentially define a patient as particularly vulnerable or likely to be marginalized. Their religion, their race and ethnicity, their marital status, their socioeconomic status. It turns out that those variables are reasonably predictive of somebody's likelihood of showing up to a clinic visit or not. That can be concerning because depending on your clinical responses to this, you may actually propagate biases based on those variables. In other words, make things worse, even if your goal is to essentially make your clinic run more smoothly by changing appointment times or cadence and so forth. This group ultimately convinced the vendor to take out those variables and make a modified version of this, and they found that to be helpful. They still noticed, though, that the model, even because of sort of implicit data creep into this, was potentially propagating some of those biases. And so what they did is they essentially said they were only going to use positive clinical responses based on this, meaning if a patient was flagged as being at high risk of missing an appointment, they would spend extra effort to call that patient, check on barriers. Do you need a ride? Do you need a translator? Do you need something else? Rather than a potentially negative or punitive response, such as double booking that clinic slot because they expected only one patient to show up then. Right? That would shortchange the most vulnerable patients when they do show up. The clinician is in with two patients at once. And I think that could be a particular challenge here. And we saw this information leakage with a vendor's proprietary sepsis model on its first iteration. And this is, again, a quote from a US news media story where the original model, I think one of the predictor variables was antibiotics being ordered. So it's a bit of a tautology, right? This is going to be reasonably accurate at identifying patients whom the clinicians have already identified as having sepsis. So it's a bit of a problem just sort of from an implementation standpoint because it's not useful. It's essentially telling people something they already know. So once you understand the underlying problem to be solved and understand something about the model and how it came to be, you got to think about the clinical workflow. Who's going to be impacted by the model? What's going to be the intervention? And I said that the model is not an intervention, right? The model is a strategy by which we're trying to change care or change behavior or change treatment. Maybe the intervention is an active alert, a page, a pop-up on your screen that interrupts you. Maybe it's a dashboard. Maybe it's a subtle change to your existing interface or patient list. I think those are all open possibilities, and it's probably going to vary based on the use case. It's also important to think about the workflow budget. So we often think about AI tools as identifying patients who are at high risk of something or scenarios that are high risk, and I think that's good. But recognize that when you do something that's high risk, the response is generally to turn up the volume knob in terms of response, meaning to bring more people to a situation, more attention to a situation, do more tests, deliver more treatments, potentially move a patient to a higher level of care, like from the wards to the ICU, or admit the patient from the emergency department to the hospital wards. That's fine. In fact, that's often what should happen. We also might have an opportunity to look at the low end of risk and turn down knobs. If a patient is getting moderate intensity care and they score very low on some sort of a risk tool, might it be possible to check on them less frequently and still keep them safe, and thereby spend our budget for workflow elsewhere? I think this is generally an open opportunity that we don't think about very much, and so it can be fun to get creative in thinking through these workflows. So how do you decide who's impacted? Um, I really like this approach called a sort of a stakeholder assessment or a stakeholder map. Uh, to do this, you start with your beneficiary, who you're trying to help or act upon in the middle. And then you sort of move externally in layers in terms of who is closest and has the most direct sort of influence or interaction with the center of this circle. And then you continually move out. And each time you go out a layer, you ask the people in those layers to sort of check your assumptions. Am I putting your group in the right place in this sort of structure, number one? And number two, who am I missing? And I think this is another one of these kind of unspoken, sort of unsaid aloud, important takeaways here is that unknown unknowns can really burn you if you're not careful. And so when you're thinking about who is impacted by the model, it's not just who do you, as the governing committee, thinks will be impacted by the model, but who does everybody on your stakeholder map think will be impacted? Because you don't know what you don't know, and the people who are deeply embedded in care will tell you, you didn't foresee this, but this actually is going to change how I do my pre-rounding. This is going to change how quickly I can get X and Y and Z done. Have you thought about that? Can you help me redo my workflow based on that? So this is an example from an implementation project we're doing at my prior hospital around an early warning system for patients with cancer who are in the hospital. This is the stakeholder map from that. What does the alert look like? Is it interruptive? Is it not interruptive? We generally sort of, again, make this a dichotomous thing. And there's this, I think, sort of prevailing assumption that interruption is what's needed to have success. But at least in some examples, non-interruptive alerts do work. Pharmacists watching dashboards might be able to change antibiotic protocols and so forth. And so we've seen this in sepsis in both emergency departments and hospital wards, where non-interruptive alerts, when they were designed well, were highly engaged and seemed to actually improve outcomes. So I can share just sort of at a top level. When I was at my prior hospital in St. Louis, I was involved in this sepsis example where we actually simultaneously had top-down and bottom-up influence to try to drive this forward. So we had executives that were asking us to try to improve our compliance with some federal mandates in terms of what we're reporting and doing to make sure that our hospitals were going to be reimbursed appropriately. They wanted to invest, sort of leverage existing investments in our electronic health record. And the people who were using these things were fatigued by clinical alerts and pop-ups and wanted us to try to do a little bit better. And we had research groups that wanted to do it. So we used this framework with them and we asked them, can you specify your problem more clearly? Are you trying to detect sepsis at the moment it happens or shortly thereafter? Or are you trying to predict sepsis in patients who are likely to get it soon? Those are two different things. How will using a model help? What's the workflow going to be around this? Is this going to be under the operations umbrella or research? We sort of drilled down and got this to an operational standpoint where the task was sepsis prediction. And we did end up then having some success in sort of helping optimize the vendor-based sepsis model for clinical use in particular scenarios. So we talked then about sort of the development and selection of a model. We've talked a little bit about the deployment in terms of getting your core group of informants, having them become your champions and your sort of advisors on what the workflows might look like. But you have to maintain things, and then you have to take them away and put a new model in place if things aren't going well. And so when you're maintaining and measuring and deciding if you're going to keep using things, you have to say, okay, how do my performance measures get interpreted based on this use case? So again, to sort of use the sepsis example, if the goal is to predict sepsis or detect sepsis at its onset, many of the models that have been out there are not great. In other words, they sort of do a middling job at predicting sepsis before it happens or catching it right at its onset. And here in this figure, you can see one of the sort of prominent vendor models that's been discussed had an area under the receiver operator curve of about 0.63 when the predictive model scores were censored at and after the time of sepsis onset. In other words, this model was not all that much better than a coin flip in catching sepsis early. Well, that's fine, and sort of, suggests don't use it if the goal is to sort of prompt us to be acting anticipatorily for patients. But maybe the goal is actually to ensure compliance with a 3-hour federally mandated bundle of care that is a series of checkboxes, because that's going to determine hospital reimbursement for sepsis. And complying with those things generally does make patient outcomes better, because if you're not within 3 hours, that means you're later, which means your antibiotics are too late, and so forth. If you allow scores to accrue 3 hours after sepsis onset, the model performance is much better. The scores go up right when the patient has become septic. And so in the first hour or two after sepsis, there's a lot of useful information. And so if your intervention is allowed to lag in time, if the use case is a bit different, the model utility could be better. And it's the same model, it hasn't changed. So thinking about the use case will tell you a lot about your utility. Right, when you're choosing infrastructure, when you're choosing to go with the EHR vendor or the bespoke infrastructure, there are pros and cons for either. This is a sort of simple table of some of these things that I've put up here. Obviously, the EHR and other vendors are trying to make it as easy for you to do as possible. So they often will come with installation kits and cookbooks and support, at the elbow support or telesupport. The drawback to these is that you can only choose from what they have on their menu, and you're obviously locked into that vendor. If you do things in a bespoke way, you can run anything you can build, but that requires very skilled people to build and maintain it, and you have to own those people and sort of their work. And it's brittle, meaning if your API changes or some of your data infrastructure or scaffolding changes, you're on your own to fix that. Understanding where these data are can be really, really important. And I think this is another one of the areas of disconnect that I see from research teams to the clinical implementation teams sometimes. So research teams often get their data from the bottom of this list, from something like an enterprise data warehouse or an integrated analytics database. These are designed for research and quality reporting data, meaning they're designed to be pulled from, but not necessarily pushed to. They're not static, but they're also not real-time and transactional, meaning they're interval censored. They update nightly or weekly or something like that. These data may have had partial data cleaning as well. Not always, but sometimes. But sometimes there are concepts that are abstracted or compiled for easy reporting. That's going to be a challenge when you then have built a model that relies on some of those engineered features or sort of overly clean data, and you go to put your model into place in the production EHR, which is often called the CIS, the Clinical Information System. That's where real-time care is happening. To the extent that your observed data that you got for modeling and building and testing, to the extent that those do not map to your CIS perfectly, you have more work to do to adjust your model before it can go live. Knowing where the data come from can be really helpful. So this is the takeaway, at least at the hospitals that I've worked. Most of the researchers are working with data that have sort of been snapshotted and sandboxed. And even if they are quote unquote raw electronic health record data, which I work with a lot, the databases that they come from are slightly different than the production EHR database. Understanding those differences can be key. So when you build a model, it's not as sort of as simple as just having like an R model object, right? It has to be packaged with everything that would need to open itself up in the computing environment and run. Dependencies, model weights, meta instructions, and so forth. You can do this with Python or R or Julia. You can do this in older things like PMML and XML files. You can do this through an API. It depends on what you're choosing to do as to which of those approaches you'll go with. Each of these approaches needs people. So EHR embedded work needs EHR analysts and data scientists. Bespoke work needs a lot of engineers. Hybrid work probably needs all three. And so it's going to depend again on your use case, but your group, your hospital, your clinic will think about what do we have available to us? What might we be able to sort of build or share? And how does that inform the ways in which we might be able to choose AI solutions? It'd be lovely if for every problem we could sort of pull multiple options and compare them head to head. Sometimes we can, but it's hard enough to do this once. And so to ask your team to do it more than once to map variables to multiple different complex models, to package models, to monitor models, etc. That's a lot of work. And so if you are having trouble answering the question of like who can do this and who can pay for this, that might be one roadblock to doing multiple models at the same time. And if you're going to do this, you do need to sort of pre-decide what is the threshold for deciding what the winner is going to be. And what will you do if two models perform equally? Will you choose the parsimonious one? Will you choose one that is going to be less, less exposed to sort of decay over time? How will you decide that? What does it mean to evaluate these models? So 4 lessons here, I think. Silent evaluation is really helpful up front. Pragmatic evaluations are very valuable. Iteration and sort of mixed methods research, again, very valuable. And then just a couple of kind of pearls about study design. Um, so why do you want to conduct a silent evaluation? So this is research that I led where we looked at a vendor sepsis model across 9 hospitals in a network. And what we found was that the same model had wildly different performance based on how much sepsis each hospital was seeing. That shouldn't be the case. Your prevalence of a disease should not influence your sensitivity and specificity. And yet it does, and it's probably to do with sort of data set sifts and hospital level idiosyncrasies. But you don't know that up front. You don't know which direction things are shifting. And so the takeaway here, I think, is that you don't know which hospital you are until you evaluated yourself. And if you're doing this in a non-silent way, meaning if you're just turning it on, then you are risking being one of these poor performers and having that actually affect patient care. And so I think this is a good and compelling rationale for why you should do a silent evaluation up front. What is a silent evaluation? Well, it's both under the hood, meaning like, does the model work in the test and the production environment? Meaning, does it collect the variables that are mapped to it? Does it calculate scores? Does it file scores to a flow sheet? Do the scores show up to the right people if they need to show up? So all of those technical things matter, but also the workflow. If it's going to show up, where does it show up on the screen? Did you build this in the right size, in the right way? Does it throw errors if anything happens, like your patient goes off the floor for a CT scan? If they're missing from the wards, do they disappear from your flow sheets? Those sorts of things. If you're going to have active alerts, what are the thresholds? Here are some options for how to figure this out. Maybe you're not going to alert because alerts can obviously sort of become infinite if you sort of have enough people meeting a threshold. Maybe you're resource limited, and so you're only going to do a top N or top K number of responses. The sort of 5 sickest patients every day will get a rapid response evaluation, for example. I make a list of all the steps incrementally, and I test each one. In the test environment, does the model run? Does it fit a score? Does it file the score? The same thing in the production environment. And then if we're sort of testing out the connections to an alert, if I build sort of a fake connection to a pager or to a mock pop-up, does it work? And then if I turn this on prospectively, what happens? We'll talk just briefly about thresholds. I don't want to go into this too much. Um, Most models, the default threshold for positive is 50%, meaning that if somebody has a 50% positive for something, for a response, that would be the way that it would set an alert. That really makes sense only if you think that the consequences of false positives are the same as the consequences of false negatives, and they really never are. There's no universal rule for this. This is a value judgment and a context that you have to sort of think about to make these decisions. You can still quantify these numbers. You can quantify them empirically through discrete choice experiments and other activities like that. So it doesn't just have to be doing a poll or asking around for where you should set things, but it does need to be sort of decided for each project, for each model, and so forth. I won't belabor the decision curves because I want to respect our time and make sure we have time for conversation. Um, Iterating can be really helpful. So a lot of times I will tweak things behind the scenes intentionally to see what happens, and then follow that iteratively with another tweak. This is sort of a robustness check to make sure things don't break, but it also can give you sort of unexpected and helpful informations about, maybe you can get a similar accuracy with fewer sort of false alerts or something like that. And so I like to do those sorts of things. There are lots of ways to be pragmatic about this. And so I like to use fake front and back ends quite a bit. A fake front end is really about the user experience. So if I have a tool that's accurate, how will people use it? How will they interact with it? We would sort of give them some of the basics and let them sort of tell us by their eyes and their hands and their comments what they're going to do with it. The fake backend is all about the infrastructure. So you build temporary infrastructure, and then you see what happens as people are using it. This temporary infrastructure might be a person with a notebook and a telephone. Like, it can be that simple. This is how you can deploy something and test it and start to build towards scaling up without paying for all the overhead at once. It can be very, very useful. I mentioned this earlier. So in implementation science, the terminology here would be that the model itself is not an intervention. An intervention is a clinical intervention. It's what do the clinicians do to the patients. The model is part of an implementation strategy, and I think frameworks can be really helpful. So implementation strategies, clinical decision support is an implementation strategy. So how do you do something like this? Well, you name the strategy, you define it, you specify it, and you specify it through this kind of a rubric here. So these slides, I think, give a really nice sort of walkthrough of how to build not just the model, but all of the relevant responses for it. Implementation science has probably too many frameworks in general, but here are some that I think can be useful when you're thinking about determinants. So determinants meaning what are the barriers and facilitators to driving something forward. So there's the IPARIS, there's the CFIR, there's the TICD. You can see the domains running up and down the left side here of what sorts of important things these models are considering. This will help you understand your users and your beneficiaries and your context quite a bit as you're preparing. When you're going live and you're developing your tools before you go live, you can use implementation science frameworks and checklists to think about what it is you're building. Does it have the right content? Is the user interface appropriate? Is your implementation team the right team to do this? And then there are also implementation evaluation frameworks like REAIM. These are frameworks that essentially give you a rubric of outcomes to consider all along the spectrum of this project. So who is it reaching? Is it reaching everybody it should? Is it effective? Are people using it and adopting it? And so forth. How do you evaluate these? Well, we'll talk numerically, but I think probably the biggest lesson here is that no matter what quantitative approach you take to evaluate your model, it's really a great idea to do some sort of formal or even informal mixed messages, meaning surveys, interviews, observations, and evaluations like that, to really understand what you can't get from just pure quantitative approaches. I think that between the lines can do a lot of helpful informativeness when you're thinking about whether something has succeeded or not. So you can do a traditional randomized controlled trial. Here are two randomized trials of machine learning tools built into EHRs where patients were cluster randomized to an intervention and they had positive findings. You can choose a pragmatic design that may be directly interventional, or it may be sort of, gosh, what do you call it? Like sort of a pseudo-experimental design, or a kind of a sort of advanced quantitative design, like a stepped wedge observation or a stepped wedge trial. These can be really great when your need to move and get started is too urgent to design the perfect trial. And you can still get very, very helpful inferences here. So this is from the Kaiser system in California, where they had a pragmatic design study that found a benefit to a machine learning model that predicted clinical deterioration that was sourced to a watchtower to help direct rapid response teams in nursing care. You can do observational studies if you design it well and adjust for important biases and sort of design your cohort to minimize things like immortal time and selection bias and so forth. And so this is from some of the sepsis work that got some national attention earlier this past year from the Johns Hopkins group. We should monitor what we're doing because life changes. The world is dynamic. So this is research that Karen Deep led and that I was involved in a little bit from the beginning of COVID, where the Michigan hospitals were using a vendor sepsis model in clinical care, meaning that it would cross a threshold and it would alert nurses about a probability of sepsis that was increasing. And the nurses then had cultures to draw and lactic acids to test and other things to check off in terms of a list. And COVID happened. And because everybody that came into the hospital was febrile and tachycardic and so forth, they all looked septic. In fact, they all probably were septic if you think that viral sepsis ought to trigger a model like this. The number of alerts skyrocketed, even when the number of patients in the hospital actually dropped by about a third. This was really hard from a nursing workflow standpoint. And so the nurses actually called their clinical intelligence committee and asked them to turn the model off. And Karen Deep and I had a conversation about this and wondered if it was going to be the same elsewhere. So my hospital system and several other hospitals that were collaborating with did not have this model running in production for clinical use, but had it running on a silent evaluation. And so we were able to sort of provide triangulatory data to fill out this figure here, where each line is one of our hospitals, showing you how big the hospital is and what happened with everything centered around day zero of the first COVID case. And it was pretty consistent that overall, as hospital census went down, the number of sepsis alerts would have gone up had all the hospitals turned this on at the same set of thresholds. And you can see again, here's COVID examples of when a different model's performance fell off after the sort of, first wave of COVID patients showed up. This is based on data, I think, from New York City, from an emergency setting. So again, a place where, sort of a shift in patients changed the model's performance. So you model it in two domains, I think. You monitor your model in the clinical domains, meaning are your outcomes changing? How many outcomes are off target? And you monitor things technically, meaning did the variables change their mapping? Is your infrastructure changing? Is something under the hood about to break? These technical considerations may be sort of looking at things like the missingness over time. So how many patients would you have expected to have scores filed that aren't? And maybe the patient locations have changed their names in your system. And so therefore, patients are no longer meeting the criteria to be getting scored, even though they're in the same physical space, because it's called something different now. You can look at your score distribution over time, because it should remain a relatively similar shape, or at least it should follow a pattern that you would expect. There's a group that sort of is collaborative based on folks from the University of Michigan and some of the Harvard hospitals and a few other places that have put out some recommendations in terms of thinking about those sorts of data set shifts. But the big takeaway is to really sort of, monitor serially and carefully and ask kind of rubriced questions around that. Updating a model is important to do sometimes, but it has some risks. Your model will get worse over time. It may get worse over time for reasons that you want it to get worse over time. It may get worse over time for reasons that you don't want it to get worse over time. And so understanding why can be really important. And we were part of the research, I think, that kind of helped drive the second iteration of this vendor model forward. And the second version I'm really excited about. I think it's a huge step forward in terms of how a really sort of big and well-trained model from a vendor can sort of look at the right things and hopefully make quite accurate predictions. So this is an opportunity, I think, where sort of redoing the model was the right thing to do and has turned out great. But we should keep in mind that updating models can be harmful. So it may be that a model is so successful that it changes clinician behavior, and then there are counterfactual outcomes that no longer happen. So if the model is prompting us to recognize sepsis earlier, and our sepsis patients are then doing better, our data set is going to start to shift, meaning our care for sepsis will get better and our sepsis patients will look a little bit different. Our model won't recognize sepsis as well, and its AUC will actually get down. We shouldn't retrain based on this, right? We don't want to retrain the model to recognize non-septic patients, which is probably what it would do, because the patients who have sepsis wouldn't be meeting that variable label anymore. We want to leave that model alone. And so thinking about reasons to update the model, if the mappings change, if your predictor missingness changes, if your outcome definition has changed and therefore you need a new label, if your patient population is changing, those are good reasons to update. But if you're seeing performance changes and it's not in these domains, you need to dig a bit deeper. So to sort of cycle back to that sepsis comment, so we did sort of follow this kind of a process where we had a series of sprints to build and test and ultimately then migrate to production with sepsis models. And this is then kind of the life cycle that my prior organization has been using to think about how they'll do this at scale for a lot of different organizations. So if you're ready to get started on this, you'd write a charter. There are charters that are out there in the ether. I think certainly, speaking to organizations that are open to sort of sharing or helping craft those things can be really great. I would be glad to help make connections if people have questions about that. But drafting a charter is the first step, and getting the team is also sort of step 1A. Um, I would say that building the people and the infrastructure is probably more beneficial than putting all of the sort of crossed T's and dotted I's for infrastructure. They're both important, but I would start with people first and sort of make sure that you have everybody who needs to be in the room to inform how you build your processes and how you build your policies. And then let people know you exist. You should be the sort of funnel for these models coming to fruition in the EHR. So does Health IT know about you? Does your chief medical officer and your chief quality officer know about you? How do they get in touch with you? And so forth. And then you start working. You may start working with models that you yourself as a group put forward to yourselves. You'll need a process for handling that. You may start with models that others bring to you. I think that sort of is the sort of it's time to go, and you think about how to jump into it like that. Right now, our governance is sort of thinking about this in a reactive standpoint, meaning like use cases, sort of du jour, and edge cases. And I'm really sort of open to conversations about how we might build a forward-looking strategy to sort of think about what's next as opposed to what's right now. I frankly don't know where to start for that conversation. I think it's important that we sort of are open and transparent about that. And so if any of you are interested in carrying that on at some point, I would love to sort of think about further times to talk. I want to thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to chatting. Before I do, I really just want to also acknowledge some people. So Karen Deep is a friend and a peer mentor who has taught me so much about sort of how to think about this kind of work and do this work. And he's who brought me to sail with him, which is where Alejandro and I got introduced. And so I really am very grateful for everything he has sort of taught me and shared with me. And then the folks below are all of my scientific mentors at my old institution, at my new institution, experts in epidemiology, clinical care delivery, sepsis, informatics, machine learning. They also have sort of taught me basically everything that I'm able to share today is because of their wisdom and their kindness in mentoring me. And then the grants that have funded my work are over here on the right side. So that is the set of slides that I had, and I am really happy to open things up for conversation.
Okay, Dr. Patrick Lyons, thank you very much for that valuable and impressive presentation that you just make us to think about how to implement in a correct way the artificial intelligence algorithms that we have. So this time we are going to start the Q&A section. So I have two questions. The first, the ideal models or ideal algorithms in healthcare must be explainable, dynamic, precise, maybe autonomous, fair, and reproducible. So we have in Colombia the limitation about the healthcare system. It's running slow. So what are the main advantages and disadvantages of adopting external validation versus creating local models or maybe local teams with artificial intelligence? What you can suggest us to do?
Yeah. So I'll just restate your question, Alejandro, to make sure I kind of have all the parts, because it's got a lot of, I think, really sort of rich and important ideas in it. So to kind of go backwards, I mean, the big question is, how do you think about this sort of work in Colombia, where there may be some fragmentations of care from site to site as opposed to centralization? There may be some different resource availability from site to site as well. And when you're building these models, you have so many different best practices, so to speak, that are told. Make this fair and equitable, make this transparent, make it accurate, make it dynamic, make sure you have external validation, make sure you have internal validation. That's a lot to keep in mind, right? So I guess the question is sort of, how do you think about it and how do you weigh some of those priorities? Does that sound right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's all right.
I think the first thing I would say is external validation is probably not as imperative as others might argue that it is. Um, in and of itself, it doesn't mean anything really. I think about external validation as a way to test the future validity of your model, meaning just sort of answering the question as to like, will this work in unseen patients when they come to me? So we often talk about, external as needing two data sets. But if the problem is a local problem, and if the data are going to be idiosyncratic based on your local features, why does it matter what the hospital down the street or in another state is doing and how it performs? Because things might be very different. Now, if you have an apples to apples hospital, if you think your case mix is similar, if you think the patient populations are similar and so forth, that's a different story. But I wouldn't say that you would need external validation just for external validation's sake. What I would say instead is that temporal validation can be a really helpful tool. So take your training data, which might be, say, from 2023, and do a validation partially retrospectively on the first few months of 2024, and then do a silent prospective validation on the remainder of the 2024 data. That is external in time, meaning it's not just sort of testing it on the same data pool that it was trained on. But I think it's more relevant to what it is you're doing because you want to know, will this affect our patients? So that's comment number one. I think comment number two about sort of how do you think about stewarding these resources and maybe sharing these versus sort of keeping things local. I think it really is going to depend on where you think your organizational strengths are and if you think you can sort of arrange partnerships that work. Gosh, we happen to have a deep bench of data scientists, but we could really use a standardized vocabulary or a common data model for this. I wonder if our neighbors down the street who have that would be willing to share their best practices for curating it or share some of their model for us. And in return, maybe we can open up that our data scientists would help to teach them something or something else. And so that, I realize that's a bit of a soft answer, but I think it's really about sort of figuring out like, where do I have sort of extra resources or resources that I can share without losing something, and that might be a win-win for my group and for another group. Um, I guess the last thing I'll say to your sort of question of all these priorities is I personally am undersold by explainability. I'm not sure that explainability will move behavior as much as we hope it will. I think people are going to be skeptical until things change their behavior and until they see them working. I think it's often that we sort of fall back on it's not explainable as a reason to not trust something. But even when it is explainable, I'm not sure that it I think what engenders trust is personal connections with the implementation team, frankly, and the champions. That's a personal take. That's not based on any empirical evidence that I'm aware of.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you so much for the response. We have a question, Adriana Beltran. Go ahead. If you can turn on your camera, ¿puedes prender la cámara? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lyons, for your insightful conference. There are a lot of challenge for the implementation of AI in our hospitals. And one of the most important challenge is that how can we manage the biases resulted in the low quality and data missing in the electronic health records in the context of real world evidence used for take a decision, a clinical decision?
That is an outstanding question. So just to reiterate it for the group, the question is, how do we think about and mitigate biases with AI tools that are brought about essentially by biased availability and quality and missingness and the features of the electronic health record data? What a tremendous question. I think that this is an area of huge need in research. There's a grant that some colleagues and I just submitted to look at essentially the availability of the EHR for a patient as a collider. So thinking about like epidemiologic collider bias. we don't know who we don't know. And so if you condition on the patient's presence in the electronic health record for the underlying, development of sort of, outcomes data to suggest which features to put into a model, and then also to train the model, it's not going to be well fit to the people who don't show up until they show up, right? Until they come in need. I think we saw this in COVID, where we had models that were trained on people who were previously at certain hospitals, and then a lot of people who did not seek care came and they looked a little bit differently, and some of our tools weren't as accurate. Um, so how do we do this? I think this is where we can do sort of a balance with what I was just suggesting to Alejandro. So I was suggesting that doing things in a local sense can be very valuable if you have the tools and resources, and if you're very comfortable with your local context as a key feature of what makes a model so good. I think for some big picture models, like predicting critical illness or the need for hospital readmission or something like that, which is a problem that faces everybody, I think there probably is value at doing very big and broad models that are not hyperlocal. They may be slightly less accurate overall than a highly accurate, detailed hyperlocal model, but they're also going to be more fair for everybody, because it may be that my hospital happens to take care of people who are without a home, and this hospital happens to take care of a lot of people who have HIV infection or something else that's going to make their case mix of sort of illnesses and of patterns look different. And so I think this is where we can strategically partner to say, this is a common problem that affects us all. Can we build a common model that could be easily used because it has features that are relatively standard and easily obtainable, but the patterns from site to site may look different. And then we'll put them together to sort of smooth out some of that. Yes, we'll lose a bit of accuracy, but I think we'll also sort of improve fairness. So that's one idea. It's just an idea. I don't know as to whether it will work. I think the second is you have to be as thoughtful as you are in asking that question and put those biases and concerns for them as part of your evaluation rubric. So in the United States, for example, one of the biggest biases is about race and ethnicity, right? And so people who are not white tend to receive worse care. They obviously have worse social, sort of the things available to them. And so because of that systemic racism, their outcomes are worse at baseline. We need to sort of make sure that everything we're doing is, number one, not propagating that, making it bigger. Number two, closing it if at all possible, right? And so I think understanding what is the base rate, understanding can we get accurate measurements for everybody who we need to, and what would it take to then interpret those? Those are kind of the pieces of advice that I would have. Now that may differ from country to country in terms of who those groups are. It may be more driven with religion or socioeconomic standing or age, depending on the clinical problem as well. But I think a sort of awareness and thoughtfulness about those is the first step.
Thank you for participating, Adriana, in this discussion. I have other question. If someone have a question, please please just open the mic and say it. Dr. Patrick, one of the challenge I face is how to integrate and manage the data from different sources. So, such as electronic health records, medical images, lab tests. I have heard that data marts can be useful tool for this purpose. There is some data marts with standardized data structures. So could you please explain me what is a data mart? What is the difference between data mart and data warehouse? And if you think that strategy could improve the generation governance, and maybe the fairness of algorithms?
Yes. A great question. So the question is about sort of the terminology around data marts and data warehouses and data lakes. What's the value proposition? How should we think about them? How does it influence governance? So to take those kind of going backwards, they are another thing that needs to be governed as opposed to something that will help your governance, unfortunately. So they make more work. but they are exceptionally valuable and I think worth the investment and worth the work to govern them for a couple of reasons. So one is the idea behind any of these, and I sort of am partial to the idea of this data lake where you have layers of data. And the way that you would sort of conceptualize this is that at the floor, at the kind of bottom of the lake or the ocean, is everything that is raw. And it has had zero attention paid to its organization whatsoever. It's just clinical, sort of tabular data and text from notes and image data, you name it. And as we collect more, it's going to get broader and deeper. And then above that, you can build various levels of sophistication, which I would call knowledge layers. A good example of a knowledge layer might be something like a SOFA score built from vital signs and medications. So we would use a SOFA score for a lot of clinical studies, observational research, but you might also use the SOFA score as part of your predictive model. You would need to be able to sort of have some code to automate the parts of the lake that need to go up to the SOFA score. But then the SOFA score can be accessed like you would from any relational database. And so this is sort of a meta structure around, I'd say, kind of what are basically now like smaller databases that have, soft borders between them. It's efficient from a storage standpoint, which is one big value there. And so when you're thinking about an enormous amount of data that is only going to keep growing, and how do we make places for it and so forth, efficiency is one of the keys. And then I think the fact that it can be very sort of specifically curated by people like you who are physician informaticists who have clinical knowledge and technical knowledge in these areas, like the building of those is key. That to do it, you do need to specify a data model for some of those elements. And that data model might be something like OMOP, which is sort of growing in its prevalence in the United States. I don't know if it's growing internationally or not. You could use others. You could develop something that is on your own. But the biggest value there, you mentioned the ideas about collaboration and bias. This is, I think, where it's really helpful. If you can get other people to do things similarly, to have an analogous setup for their data lake or for their tables in some of these areas, then you can build a data exchange where they can be connected. Or you can do something that's federated, where maybe you actually do model building centrally and then you distribute the model so that it can be evaluated at individual places without having to change data because you know that you've got the same format and the same structure and so forth. I think that because we've sort of built some of these data lake architectures, this is like a very topical and growing thing right now. And because there's, I think, sort of better, underlying computer language to do this, right? I think about things like the Apache Arrow project, where we have better file storage setups now and better ways to stream data and send stacks of data. This may be worth the investment. Does that answer your question?
Yes, of course. Yes, impressive and very valuable for us. Okay, if we don't have questions right now, I'm going to review the chat. No, okay, we have a question here right now. Okay, Doctor, maybe can you open the mic and camera, please? Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Alejandro. Hi, Dr. Lyons. Congratulations. I can. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions. Have you found resistance in other doctors in the deploy of IA algorithms?
Yes.
And the second question is, do you consider the federated learning as a solution to overcome the limitation of the generability?
Good questions. As to the first question, the question of do I get resistance sometimes, especially from physicians? Yes. In fact, the resistance comes almost entirely from physicians. What I have found is that nurses generally like the idea of this. I think nurses are very appropriately concerned that it might sort of burden their workloads. I think physicians have sort of already learned from some of our kind of public missteps in getting this off the ground that if it goes sort of not as intended, there will be more interruptions, more pop-ups in their screens and so forth. And I think people are appropriately apprehensive about that. And so that's kind of, to get to my comment about, I think that trust will come less from explainability and more from relationship building. I think having a committee or a governance structure with strong champions who are sort of, seen by the frontline clinicians or are part of the frontline clinicians, I think that's so valuable, because then it's a conversation rather than a sort of, outward in kind of puzzle. Your second question is about, is federated learning a good solution towards generalizability? It is in many circumstances, right? Because then you can do sort of the fine tuning or the retuning of models for hyperlocal situations. You have to have a shared structure to do it, and that is hard sometimes, to get people to sort of have their data coded and formatted in the same way. And I also think that if you are able to achieve that meaning you're able to get people to code and file their data in the same way, you have addressed part of the generalizability problem anyway. Not all of it, for sure, because there are, as I said, like data set shifts and case mix things and care processes that differ. But at least you've sort of taken the measurement part of that away, because your data should at least sort of be, in the same kind of column, in the same general formatting. Maybe the outliers are a little bit different. Maybe the distribution's a little bit different. So I think, the lift is to get people to sort of build their data structures collectively. And then, yes, I think federated learning is a pretty exciting opportunity to try to do this better.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Andres. He's an internist too, and he's an enthusiast like everybody here, and with artificial intelligence. So we have more questions. Anybody wants to participate? Okay, we have Adriana. Adriana wants to speak and participate in the discussion. So go ahead.
Dr. Lyon, one more question in the same way of the previous question is, how can we convince the hospital managers to implement AI in the hospital, in the takeover or in the implementation of AI in the hospitals, to a better performance of our clinical decision and the better performance of the budget of the hospitals?
Yeah, that's such a great question, right? So sort of how do you make that value proposition to the administrators who have the control of the resources? I mean, my favorite strategy has nothing to do with health IT, and it just is, sort of how do I convince them that their problem is my problem, and vice versa, right? So like, if I'm interested in trying to get an AI solution to go live in the sepsis space, well, how do I convince them that sepsis is their problem as well? So maybe it's that I can show them a patient outcomes gap. Maybe it's that I can show them a money gap, that they're not getting reimbursed like they could, potentially because, so like at least in the United States, where we sort of have what I would say is not particularly value-based care in a lot of circumstances. If you bill for sepsis, you can bill for more money. And so hospitals that are treating sepsis want to make sure that they have documented all of the cases that they're treating. That's a use case for AI, right? So you could have an AI tool that will make predictions as to whether or not this patient had sepsis based on the orders that were done, the vital signs, and so forth. And then that AI tool might nudge a coding specialist or a clinician reviewer or a quality and safety specialist to go back and ask for more documentation or check the documentation. So that might be an in to say, gosh, it looks like we're losing money on this thing that we should not be losing money on, just because we haven't been capturing all of the appropriate data that we should be documenting. I bet an AI tool could help us solve that. And then if that's a success, then you can grow it from there and say, well, we're already collecting all of this data to use in an AI tool to catch sepsis after the fact for our documentation. Maybe we should try to, build a parallel version of it to do things in clinical time and prompt clinical care. Then the incremental costs should be very low because you've already got an environment built up, you've already got some of the mappings done and the tools in place. And so then it's just about sort of getting resources for the clinical implementation and workflow design, which might be easier. So sometimes it can be about, kind of piggybacking what you sort of need from the research or the operations standpoint on what the system needs from the, resource stewardship standpoint. That's not a very technical answer. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but that sort of is the strategy that I would think about is sort of how can I align my goals and my problems with whatever the organization perceives their problems to be.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting and important for us. Dr. Patrick Lyons showed us a beautiful patient-centered approach with artificial intelligence to be a step forward in this topic. So thank you very much for being with us. We are looking forward to our next opportunity so we can dig deeper at this interesting and challenging topic, as my colleague says. And please, thank you please thank you very much. We are greetings for that academic session. And okay, that's all.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. This is really lovely to speak with you all. You ask great questions. I'm excited to get to connect again and would love to talk more in the future. Particularly if there's ways we can exchange ideas and think about, future research and so forth. So let's please do continue the conversation that way.
Oh, thank you very much. Have a nice rest of the day and be safe.
Same. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.